Marcus chin pressed his back against the concrete wall of the abandoned office building, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the sound of shuffling feet and low moans echoed through the darkened streets below. 3 weeks had passed since the outbreak began, and what remained of downtown Metro City had become a hunting ground for the infected. The military's evacuation had failed spectacularly, leaving behind only empty promises and scattered supplies that desperate survivors fought over like scraps thrown to starving dogs. Marcus clutched his makeshift weapon, a fire axe he'd taken from an emergency case, and listened carefully to the rhythm of the undead horde that had been tracking his small group through the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris-filled alleyways. Sarah Rodriguez, a former emergency room nurse, crouched beside him with her medical bag slung across her shoulder, its contents now more precious than gold in this new world where a simple cut could mean death if infection set in. Her dark eyes scanned the shadows, always calculating, always thinking 3 steps ahead about escape routes and safe zones. Behind them, huddled against the building's entrance, were the others who had somehow managed to survive the chaos of the first weeks. Jake Morrison, a construction foreman whose knowledge of building layouts had kept them alive more times than anyone could count. Elena Vasquez, a former police officer whose tactical training had saved them from countless close calls. And David Kim, barely 18 but possessing an uncanny ability to spot zombie movement patterns that had made him their unofficial scout. The group had been running for days, moving from one temporary shelter to another as the infected seemed to grow more organized, more persistent in their hunting behavior. What had started as random, shambling creatures had evolved into something far more dangerous. Packs that moved with purpose, communicating through sounds that chilled the survivors to their core. The streets were no longer safe, not even during daylight hours when the infected typically showed less activity. Supply runs had become suicide missions, and their carefully mapped safe houses were being discovered one by one, forcing them into increasingly desperate situations. Marcus heard the distinctive scrape of claws against concrete and knew their hiding spot had been compromised. Through the grimy window of the building's lobby, he could see shadows moving with deliberate intent, not the aimless wandering they had grown accustomed to in the early days. These infected were different, their movements coordinated, their approach strategic. Elena had been right when she warned that the zombies were adapting, learning from their encounters with the living and becoming more effective predators with each passing day. "We need to move," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much death to waste time on false hope. "They found us again." Her hands automatically checked her medical supplies, a nervous habit she had developed since the outbreak began. Every bandage, every antibiotic, every pain reliever was irreplaceable now that the hospitals lay in ruins and the pharmaceutical supply chains had completely collapsed. Jake hefted the heavy backpack containing their construction tools and emergency supplies, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that their options were running out fast. The infected had driven them further and further into the city center, away from the suburban areas where resources might still be found, into the concrete jungle where every building could be a trap and every shadow could hide death. His experience reading building blueprints and understanding structural weaknesses had kept them alive, but even his expertise had limits when faced with an enemy that never tired, never gave up, and seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. David peered through a crack in the doorway, his young face pale but determined as he watched the infected moving through the street with disturbing coordination. "There's at least 20 of them," he reported quietly, his voice steady despite the terror that Marcus could see in his eyes. "They're not just wandering anymore. They're searching, working together like a pack of wolves hunting prey." Elena checked her remaining ammunition, 3 bullets left in her service weapon, a harsh reminder of how quickly their situation had deteriorated. Her police training had prepared her for many dangerous situations, but nothing in the academy had covered fighting an enemy that felt no pain, showed no fear, and couldn't be reasoned with or intimidated. The infected were the perfect predators, and the living had become an endangered species in their own city. As the sound of the approaching horde grew louder, Marcus made a decision that would change everything for his group. Looking up at the towering buildings that surrounded them, their windows dark and their rooftops disappearing into the night sky, he realized that salvation might not come from running through the streets but from claiming the high ground that the infected couldn't reach. The war for survival was about to move vertical, and the rooftops of Metro City were about to become humanity's last battlefield. The emergency exit door burst open with a metallic clang that echoed through the stairwell like a dinner bell for the dead. Marcus took the concrete steps 3 at a time, his fire axe clanging against the metal railing as Sarah's medical bag bounced against her hip with each hurried step. Behind them, the infected had breached the building's lobby, their collective moans creating a haunting symphony that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the structure. Jake's heavy breathing filled the narrow stairwell as he hauled their supplies, his construction-hardened muscles straining under the weight of everything they owned in this hostile new world. "Keep moving," Elena commanded from the rear, her service weapon drawn and pointed down the stairs even though she knew her remaining 3 bullets wouldn't make much difference against the horde that was surely following them. Her police training had taught her to always watch the 6, and right now their 6 was filled with creatures that had once been neighbors, co-workers, and strangers who now shared only one consuming desire: to tear the living apart with their rotting hands and yellowed teeth. David's young legs carried him past the others as he scouted ahead, his keen eyes searching each floor, landing for potential threats or alternative escape routes. "Floor 12, he called back quietly, not wanting to make more noise than necessary but knowing they needed to track their progress. The stairwell seemed to stretch endlessly upward, each floor marker a small victory in their desperate race against death. As they climbed, Marcus noticed something that would change everything about how they understood their enemy. The infected below had reached the stairwell and were attempting to follow, but their coordination completely broke down when faced with the simple task of climbing stairs. They stumbled over each other, their rotting limbs unable to coordinate the complex movement required to ascend step by step. Some fell backward into the growing crowd behind them, creating a writhing mass of frustrated predators who could see their prey but couldn't reach them. "They can't climb," Sarah gasped between breaths, the realization hitting her like a bolt of lightning. Her medical training had taught her to observe symptoms and behaviors, and what she was seeing defied everything they had feared about these creatures. "Look at them, they can barely manage to walk on flat ground. Stairs are completely beyond their capabilities." Jake paused at the 15th floor landing, sweat pouring down his weathered face as he processed what this meant for their survival. His years in construction had given him an intimate knowledge of how buildings were designed, and suddenly he was seeing every structure in the city as a potential fortress. "If they can't climb stairs, they definitely can't use fire escapes or access ladders," he said, his voice filled with the first hope any of them had felt in weeks. Elena holstered her weapon as she realized the infected had stopped following them somewhere around the 8th floor. Their frustrated moans and the sound of bodies falling down the stairs confirmed what the group was beginning to understand: height was safety, and the sky was their salvation. "We need to reach the roof," she said, her tactical mind already working through the implications of this discovery. The group pushed through their exhaustion and climbed the remaining floors with renewed determination. When they finally burst through the roof access door, the cool night air hit their faces like a blessing from above. The city spread out below them, its darkened streets crawling with infected while the rooftops remained pristine and empty, untouched by the plague that had consumed everything at ground level. Marcus walked to the edge of the building and looked down at the horde that had gathered below. From this height, the infected looked small and harmless, their threatening presence reduced to tiny figures shuffling aimlessly through the streets. "We've been fighting this war all wrong," he said, his voice filled with wonder and growing confidence. "We've been trying to survive at their level when we should have been fighting from above." Sarah joined him at the building's edge, her medical bag now feeling less like a burden and more like the foundation of their new life. "Every building in this city is a potential safe house," she said, gesturing toward the endless expanse of rooftops that stretched to the horizon. "We're not refugees anymore, we're conquerors." David's sharp eyes had already spotted something that would make their new strategy even more promising. "There," he said, pointing to a building 2 blocks away where a small group of figures was visible on the rooftop, their movements clearly human rather than infected. "We're not the only ones who figured this out." Jake was already examining the structural possibilities, his experienced eye calculating distances and load-bearing capabilities. The buildings in this part of the city were close enough together that with the right materials and planning, they could potentially connect them, creating a network of safe zones high above the infected masses. Elena watched the streets below with her tactical mind working overtime, already planning fields of fire and defensive positions that would give them every advantage. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the 5 survivors stood on their rooftop and realized they had just discovered humanity's path back to dominance in a world overrun by the dead. 3 days on the rooftop had transformed the survivors from desperate refugees into strategic planners with a bold vision for reclaiming their city. Jake Morrison stood at the building's edge, his experienced construction workers' eye measuring the 12-foot gap between their current position and the adjacent office complex. The morning sun cast long shadows across the urban canyon below, where infected continued their endless patrol of the streets, completely unaware that their prey was planning an aerial assault on their territory. "The structural integrity of both buildings can handle the load," Jake explained to the group, his calloused hands sketching plans on a piece of cardboard they had found. We use steel cable from the elevator shafts, anchor it to the load-bearing supports, and create a bridge system that can support multiple people crossing simultaneously. His years of reading blueprints and understanding building codes had never been more valuable than in this moment when human survival depended on engineering precision. Sarah had been inventorying their medical supplies and creating a triage system for the expanded group they hoped to build. If we're going to start bringing other survivors up here, we need to establish medical protocols immediately, she said, her nurse's training making her think about infection control and emergency procedures. Not just zombie bites, we're talking about injuries from construction work, falls, and the general hazards of living on rooftops without proper safety equipment. Elena had spent the morning conducting reconnaissance with her binoculars, mapping the movement patterns of infected below while identifying potential human survivors in the surrounding buildings. I count at least 3 groups of people in buildings within a 4-block radius, she reported, her police training making her naturally suspicious but hopeful. The question is whether they're friend or foe, and whether they have the skills we need to make this network viable long-term. David had discovered something remarkable about their new elevated position. The infected seemed to lose interest in buildings where humans had been once they could no longer detect their presence. They're not smart enough to post guards or maintain surveillance, he observed, watching through a pair of salvaged binoculars as zombies wandered away from their building after detecting no immediate human scent. Once we're up here, we're effectively invisible to them unless we make noise or drop something. The group's attention was drawn to movement on a rooftop 3 buildings away, where a lone figure was waving a piece of white cloth in what appeared to be a distress signal. Through the binoculars, they could see it was a woman, thin and obviously desperate, gesturing toward the infected that had somehow gained access to the lower floors of her building. Her situation was deteriorating rapidly, and without help, she would soon be trapped with nowhere to go. We need to help her, Marcus said, though he knew the risks involved in any rescue operation. But more importantly, we need to establish communication protocols if we're going to coordinate multiple survivor groups across this network. His leadership instincts were telling him that their small group of 5 could never secure and maintain a large area without allies, but those allies needed to be carefully vetted and integrated into their defensive strategy. Jake had already begun lowering a steel cable from their building's mechanical equipment, testing its strength and calculating the anchor points needed for a successful bridge construction. Give me 6 hours and I can have a temporary crossing in place, he promised, his confidence built on decades of construction experience. But we need to be smart about this. Every connection we make is also a potential avenue for infected to reach us if something goes wrong. The woman on the distant rooftop had noticed their activity and was now using what appeared to be a mirror to flash signals in their direction. Elena quickly grabbed a piece of reflective metal from their salvage supplies and began sending back simple light signals, establishing the first communication link in what would become their rooftop network's information system. She's saying her name is Rebecca, Elena translated, having learned basic signal communication during her police training. She's an architect and she's trapped with supplies but no way to escape. She's got infected on floors 10 through 15, and they're trying to reach the roof access. Sarah immediately began preparing medical supplies for a potential rescue operation while Marcus coordinated with Jake on the technical aspects of rapidly deploying their bridge system. David kept watch on the street level, ensuring that their construction activity wouldn't attract unwanted attention from the infected masses below. As Jake began the dangerous work of installing anchor points for their first inter-building connection, the survivors realized they were no longer just trying to survive, they were building something unprecedented. Their rooftop network would become a new kind of city, suspended above the infected world, where human ingenuity and cooperation could flourish once again. The architect trapped on the distant building represented their first real expansion, and potentially the expertise they needed to turn their desperate plan into a permanent solution. The war for the rooftops had begun, and humanity was finally fighting back from a position of strength. The steel cable bridge trembled under Jake's weight as he made the final adjustments to the anchor system, his construction expertise being put to the ultimate test 40 stories above the infected-filled streets. Rebecca Torres stood on the opposite rooftop, her architect's eye evaluating the structural soundness of their improvised connection while infected moans echoed from the floors below her building. She had been trapped for 5 days, surviving on rainwater and energy bars, watching helplessly as the creatures methodically searched every floor for signs of human presence. The cable's secure on this end, Jake called across the gap, his voice carefully modulated to avoid attracting attention from the street level. The bridge system he had engineered using elevator cables and roof-mounted HVAC units was crude but functional, capable of supporting multiple crossings if used properly. His decades of construction experience had never prepared him for building under such desperate circumstances, but the principles of load distribution and anchor point security remained the same whether building a skyscraper or a lifeline. Elena had positioned herself as Overwatch, her binoculars scanning the surrounding buildings for any signs of trouble while her trained eye watched for movement patterns that might indicate the infected were becoming aware of their activities. "We've got company coming up the stairwell in Rebecca's building," she reported grimly, her police instincts recognizing the coordinated movement she was observing through the lower floor windows. "Multiple contacts, moving faster than usual. Something's changed about their behavior." Sarah had her medical bag ready for what she suspected would be injuries during the crossing, while David maintained communication with Rebecca using their improvised mirror signal system. The young man's sharp eyes had noticed something troubling in the streets below. Infected were beginning to gather around their building cluster in numbers that suggested coordinated hunting behavior rather than random wandering. "Rebecca needs to move now," David reported, his voice tight with concern as he watched the infected masses swelling in the streets around their position. "I'm counting at least 200 of them down there, and they're not just passing through. They're staying like they know we're up here somehow." Marcus made the decision that would define their first real test as a coordinated group. "Jake, get back here immediately. Elena, maintain Overwatch. Sarah, prepare for casualties. David, keep signaling Rebecca. She needs to understand that this is her only chance." His leadership skills were being forged in the crucible of life and death decisions, and every choice carried consequences that could doom them all. Rebecca began her crossing just as the first infected burst through the roof access door behind her. The architect's steady hands and head for heights served her well as she moved across the improvised bridge, her professional understanding of structural engineering giving her confidence in Jake's work even as the cable swayed in the wind. Behind her, the roof access door had been torn from its hinges, and infected were pouring onto the rooftop with a coordination that chilled everyone watching. "They're not trying to follow her across," Elena observed with growing alarm, her binoculars focused on the infected behavior that defied everything they thought they understood about these creatures. "They're just standing there watching. Like they're learning from what they're seeing." Jake had barely made it back to safety when the infected on Rebecca's former rooftop began doing something that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for weeks to come. Instead of giving up when they couldn't reach their prey, they began stacking themselves against the building's walls, climbing over each other in grotesque human pyramids that brought them closer to bridging the gap between buildings. "Cut the cable," Marcus ordered, watching in horror as the infected pile grew higher with systematic efficiency. "Cut it now before they figure out how to use it." Jake's construction tools made quick work of severing their connection, sending the steel cable plummeting into the street below where infected swarmed over it like ants discovering food. Rebecca collapsed onto their rooftop, her architect's mind already processing what she had witnessed. "They're adapting faster than we anticipated," she gasped, her professional training making her analyze even in the midst of trauma. Those formations weren't random, they were testing structural approaches to reach higher elevations. "We're not just fighting mindless zombies anymore." Sarah immediately began treating Rebecca for dehydration and exhaustion while Elena continued her surveillance of the surrounding area. The infected masses below had grown to nearly 1,000 strong, and their behavior was becoming increasingly organized. Some were attempting to climb the exterior walls of buildings using fire escapes, while others seemed to be systematically testing every possible route to reach the survivors above. David's young voice carried a chill that made everyone stop what they were doing. "There are more groups like this surrounding other buildings in our network area," he reported, his binoculars revealing the scope of what they were facing. "It's not just us, they're targeting every building where they've detected human presence. This isn't random anymore." The survivors realized their first real test had revealed a terrifying truth. The infected were evolving their hunting strategies, and the rooftop war was about to become far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. 2 weeks after Rebecca's harrowing rescue, the rooftop network had grown from a desperate survival strategy into a thriving aerial community spanning 6 connected buildings. The architect's expertise had transformed Jake's crude cable bridges into sophisticated walkways with safety railings and weather protection, while her understanding of structural engineering had identified the strongest buildings for expansion. Rebecca stood beside Marcus on the observation deck they had constructed, surveying their domain with the satisfaction of someone who had helped design humanity's comeback from the brink of extinction. "The Peterson building is perfect for our next expansion," Rebecca explained, pointing to a sleek office tower 3 blocks north that rose above the surrounding structures. 28 floors, reinforced concrete construction, and most importantly, it has a helicopter landing pad that could serve as our central command hub. Her architects I could see possibilities that the others missed, visualizing how their network could grow into a proper fortress city suspended above the infected world. Elena had established a comprehensive recruitment protocol after discovering that not all survivors shared their cooperative mindset. We've identified 12 more groups within our expansion radius, she reported, her police training making her naturally cautious about vetting new arrivals. But we learned the hard way that some survivors are more dangerous than the infected. The previous week had brought their first encounter with hostile humans, a group of raiders who had tried to take over their network by force, only to be repelled by Elena's tactical planning and the defensive advantages of their elevated position. Sarah had transformed the medical station into a proper field hospital, complete with surgical capabilities and a quarantine area for new arrivals who needed to be cleared of infection before joining the community. We're up to 23 residents now, she reported with professional pride, her medical bag having evolved into a fully stocked clinic. 3 more refugees arrived yesterday from the financial district, a teacher, an electrician, and a radio operator who could be invaluable for long-distance communication. David's role had evolved from scout to intelligence coordinator, his keen observations now supported by a network of mirrors, telescopes, and observation posts throughout their territory. The infected patterns are changing again, he warned, his young face serious as he studied the behavioral charts he had been maintaining. They're not just stacking anymore, I've observed them using tools. Simple ones, but they're learning to manipulate objects to reach higher positions. Jake was leading a construction crew of 6 survivors and building their most ambitious project yet, a suspended walkway that would connect their network to the Peterson building across a 30-foot gap. The construction foreman had trained several residents in basic structural engineering, creating a workforce capable of rapid expansion. With the materials we've salvaged from the hardware district, we can complete 3 more major connections this month, he announced confidently, his leadership skills growing as their community expanded. Marcus watched a group of new arrivals being processed through their security screening, each person representing both an opportunity and a potential threat to everything they had built. The teacher, Maria Santos, had brought news of other survivor communities attempting similar elevated strategies in different parts of the city, while the electrician, Tom Brady, had already begun work on a power distribution system using solar panels and building generators. The radio operator, Carl Peterson, had made contact with survivor groups as far away as the Harbor District, confirming that their rooftop strategy was inspiring similar efforts throughout the metro area. There's a group in the warehouse district that's built bridges between factory buildings, Carl reported through the crackling radio equipment they had salvaged. And downtown, there's a community that's taken over the entire mall complex, using the upper floors as living space while the infected control the ground level. Rebecca's architectural plans had grown increasingly sophisticated, with detailed blueprints for turning their network into a permanent settlement complete with gardens, workshops, and manufacturing capabilities. We're not just surviving anymore, she told the group during their evening planning session. We're rebuilding civilization literally from the ground up. Within 6 months, we could have a self-sustaining community of over 100 people. Elena's security briefings had become more complex as their territory expanded, requiring defensive strategies that could protect multiple access points while maintaining the mobility that gave them their tactical advantage. The Peterson building will give us visual command of the entire northern sector, she explained, pointing to positions marked on their tactical map. But it also exposes us to long-range threats from other survivor groups who might want what we've built. David's latest intelligence report contained disturbing news that would challenge their expansion plans. I've confirmed that infected are now using deceased companions as climbing aids systematically, he announced grimly. They're creating permanent structures out of bodies to reach higher floors. What started as random behavior has become organized construction. They're learning to build just like we are. As the survivors looked out over their growing network of connected buildings, they realized that their success had made them a target for both infected and hostile humans. The Rooftop War was entering a new phase, where expansion meant survival, but growth also meant greater dangers from enemies who were adapting just as quickly as they were. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning when the rooftop community least expected it, launched simultaneously from multiple directions by enemies who had studied their defenses with military precision. Marcus jerked awake to the sound of Elena's emergency whistle echoing across the network, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of her service weapon firing from the Peterson building's observation deck. Through the reinforced windows of their command center, he could see infected swarming up the sides of buildings using grotesque scaffolding made from their own dead, while hostile survivors rappelled down from helicopters that had appeared without warning in the pre-dawn darkness. "We've got coordinated assault from the Crimson Raiders on the east side," Elena's voice crackled through their radio system, her police training keeping her calm despite the chaos erupting around their positions. "At least 30 armed hostiles with military equipment, and they're using the infected as a distraction while they try to breach our main walkways." The Crimson Raiders were a group of former military personnel who had been systematically taking over survivor communities throughout the city, enslaving the weak and absorbing the strong into their ranks. Rebecca's architectural knowledge became crucial as she directed defensive positions from her blueprints, identifying structural weak points that could be defended and escape routes that could be used if their positions were overrun. "The Peterson Building's elevator shafts can be used as vertical escape routes," she called out over the radio, her voice steady despite the unprecedented threat to everything they had built. "But we need to seal the lower access points before the infected reach the mechanical floors." Sarah had converted the medical station into a combat triage center, her nursing training now focused on treating gunshot wounds and traumatic injuries as casualties began arriving from the outer defensive positions. "We've got 3 wounded from the eastern walkway," she reported tersely, her hands already working to stop bleeding from a survivor who had been caught in crossfire between the Raiders and their own defensive forces. "Tom's hit bad, shrapnel from an explosive device. We need to evacuate him to the secure medical facility immediately." David's intelligence network had provided early warning of the attack, but even his keen observations hadn't predicted the scale and coordination of the assault they were facing. "The infected aren't just climbing randomly anymore," he reported from his observation post, his young voice tight with concern. "They're targeting specific structural points like they've been given instructions. Someone's directing them." Jake was leading rapid response teams to reinforce their defensive positions, his construction expertise now focused on creating barriers and obstacles that could slow down both infected and human attackers. "The main suspension bridge is under attack from both sides," he radioed back to command, his breathing heavy as he worked to install emergency barricades. "We're going to lose the connection to the financial district buildings if we can't hold this position." The radio operator Carl had been monitoring enemy communications and discovered something that chilled everyone to the bone. "The Raiders aren't just trying to take over our network," he announced grimly. "They're in communication with other hostile groups throughout the city. This is a coordinated citywide assault on all elevated survivor communities. They want to eliminate the competition and establish themselves as the dominant force." Marcus made the hardest decision of his leadership experience, ordering a strategic withdrawal from their outer positions to consolidate their defenses around the core buildings that could be held indefinitely. "All units fall back to the Peterson Building Fortress," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to lead through crisis. "We're going to make our stand at the central hub and force them to come to us." Elena's tactical expertise shone as she coordinated overlapping fields of fire that turned the approaches to their main fortress into killing zones for both infected and human attackers. "The Raiders are using the infected as human shields," she observed with professional detachment, her sniper training making her deadly accurate with their limited ammunition. "But they're also losing control of the creatures they're trying to manipulate. The infected are turning on them too." The battle raged for 18 hours, with waves of infected scaling the building walls while Raider assault teams tried to breach their defensive positions using explosives and military tactics. Sarah worked tirelessly to keep their defenders in the fight, her medical skills saving lives that would have been lost in the chaos of urban warfare. Rebecca's architectural knowledge proved invaluable as she identified structural modifications that could be made under fire to strengthen their defensive positions. As the sun set on their first day under siege, the survivors realized they were facing a test that would determine whether their rooftop civilization could survive against coordinated human and infected threats. The Peterson Building had become a fortress under siege, surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy everything they had built. David's latest intelligence report revealed the most terrifying truth of all. The siege was just the beginning of a larger campaign to eliminate all elevated survivor communities and establish a new order built on brutality and domination. The Rooftop War had become a fight for the very soul of human civilization, with their small community standing as the last hope for a future built on cooperation rather than conquest. The siege had lasted 6 days when David made the discovery that would change everything about how they fought the infected. Peering through his binoculars from the Peterson Building's highest observation point, He watched in horrified fascination as infected below began systematically dismantling abandoned vehicles and using the metal components to construct crude ladders and climbing aids. "They're not just using tools anymore," he reported over the radio, his voice barely containing his disbelief. "They're manufacturing them. Creating specialized equipment for specific tactical purposes." Marcus joined David at the observation post, witnessing the infected's terrifying evolution firsthand as creatures that had once been mindless predators worked together with the coordination of a construction crew. Some infected were serving as tool carriers, others as material gatherers, while a third group focused on assembly and testing of their improvised climbing devices. The hierarchy and specialization they were observing defied everything the survivors thought they knew about zombie behavior. Elena's military training kicked into overdrive as she analyzed the tactical implications of what they were witnessing. "If they can build tools, they can build weapons," she stated grimly, her sniper rifle tracking infected movements as she searched for what appeared to be leadership figures directing the construction activities. "We're not fighting mindless zombies anymore. We're facing an enemy that can adapt, learn, and innovate faster than we can counter their strategies." Rebecca's architectural expertise became crucial as she redesigned their defensive positions to account for enemies who could now potentially breach barriers that had previously been considered impregnable. "We need multiple fallback positions with overlapping defensive capabilities," she explained while rapidly sketching new fortification plans. "If they can build ladders today, they might be constructing siege engines tomorrow. Our entire defensive philosophy needs to evolve as quickly as they are." The Crimson Raiders had also noticed the infected's evolution and were attempting to exploit it for their own tactical advantage. Carl's radio intercepts revealed that the Raiders were herding infected toward the Rooftop network's defensive positions, hoping to use the creature's new tool-building capabilities to breach barriers that human assault teams had failed to overcome. "They're turning the infected into an unwitting siege force," Carl reported, his radio operator skills proving invaluable for intelligence gathering. Jake's construction expertise was pushed to its limits as he worked around the clock to reinforce their positions against enemies who were literally building new ways to reach them. "We're in an arms race with creatures that don't need sleep, don't feel pain, and learn from every failed attempt," he explained to his construction crews, his weathered face showing the strain of constant defensive modifications. "For every barrier we build, they'll eventually figure out how to overcome it." Sarah had been treating an increasing number of psychological casualties as the community grappled with the reality that their safe haven was under threat from enemies who were evolving faster than they could adapt. "The stress is affecting everyone differently," she reported during their emergency leadership meeting. "Some people are withdrawing completely, others are becoming aggressive and paranoid. We're fighting a war on multiple fronts, external and internal." The breakthrough came when David observed infected using mirrors and reflective surfaces to coordinate attacks between different groups, essentially developing their own communication system. "They're signaling each other across distances," he announced with growing alarm. "Different infected groups are sharing information and coordinating their construction projects. This isn't random evolution, it's systematic technological development." Marcus realized that their rooftop network's survival depended on staying ahead of the infected's learning curve while simultaneously defending against human threats that were becoming increasingly sophisticated. "We need to accelerate our own evolution," he declared during an emergency community meeting. "If they can build tools, we need to build better tools. If they can coordinate attacks, we need to coordinate defenses across multiple survivor communities." Elena's tactical planning evolved to include psychological warfare elements, using the infected's new intelligence against them by creating false targets and misdirection strategies. "Intelligence can be a weakness as well as a strength," she explained while planning their next defensive phase. "If they're smart enough to plan, they're smart enough to be deceived. We can use their learning capability against them." The community's response to the escalating threat showcased human adaptability at its finest. Tom the electrician had developed early warning systems using motion sensors and automated alarms, while Maria the teacher had established training programs to rapidly educate new arrivals in advanced defensive tactics. The radio operator Carl had made contact with 17 other survivor communities, creating an information network that shared intelligence about infected evolution patterns across the entire metropolitan area. As the seventh day of the siege dawned, the survivors realized they were no longer just fighting for their own survival. They were engaging in a species-level conflict that would determine whether human intelligence and cooperation could overcome the infected's rapid adaptation and the brutal opportunism of groups like the Crimson Raiders. The Rooftop War had become an evolutionary arms race where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization, and the outcome would be determined by which species could adapt and innovate faster than their enemies could counter their strategies. 3 months after the siege ended, Marcus stood on the observation deck of what was now called the Central Spire, watching supply helicopters ferry materials between the 17 interconnected rooftop communities that comprised the Metro City aerial network. The Peterson building had been transformed into a gleaming command center with sophisticated communication arrays, manufacturing facilities, and agricultural domes that made their community completely self-sufficient. What had begun as a desperate escape to the rooftops had evolved into humanity's first successful post-apocalypse civilization, suspended above a world that was slowly being reclaimed from the infected. Rebecca's architectural vision had become reality on a scale that none of them had dared imagine during those first terrifying nights on the rooftop. The network now spanned 47 buildings connected by weatherproof bridges, pneumatic transport tubes and cable car systems that allowed rapid movement of people and supplies across the aerial city. "We're not just surviving anymore," she announced during the weekly community assembly, her voice carrying across the amphitheater they had constructed on the Central Spire's upper levels. "We're thriving, and we've created a blueprint that survivor communities worldwide are now implementing." Elena's security protocols had evolved into a comprehensive defense system that protected not just their immediate community but served as a training ground for defensive specialists from other aerial settlements. "The infected have reached their evolutionary plateau," she reported with professional satisfaction, her tactical expertise now focused on training rather than survival. "Their tool-building capabilities maxed out at simple construction aids, while our technological advancement has continued exponentially. We've achieved decisive strategic superiority." Sarah's medical facility had grown into a full hospital complex with specialized departments for trauma surgery, infectious disease research, and psychological counseling. "We've successfully treated over 300 survivors from ground-based communities," she announced proudly, her nursing background having evolved into medical administration for an entire aerial civilization. "More importantly, we've developed protocols for psychological rehabilitation that are helping people transition from survival mode to productive citizenship." David's intelligence network had become the foundation for a global communication system connecting aerial survivor communities on every continent. "We're in contact with rooftop cities in Tokyo, London, Sydney, and Sao Paulo," he reported from the communication center he now directed, his keen observational skills having evolved into strategic intelligence coordination. "The rooftop warfare strategies we developed here have been successfully implemented in 37 major metropolitan areas worldwide." Jake's construction expertise had transformed into large-scale engineering projects that were reshaping the urban landscape below. "The ground reclamation project is ahead of schedule," he announced while reviewing blueprints for automated systems that were systematically clearing infected from street-level areas. "Using remote-controlled construction equipment, we've cleared and secured a 12-block radius around our network support pillars. Within 2 years, we'll have safe ground-level access for the first time since the outbreak." The Crimson Raiders had been defeated not through direct military confrontation but through the simple fact that their brutal hierarchy couldn't compete with the cooperative efficiency of the aerial communities. Many of their former members had voluntarily joined the rooftop settlements, trading aggression for the security and purpose that came with rebuilding civilization rather than destroying it. Carl's radio facility had evolved into a global broadcasting center that coordinated everything from supply deliveries to shared technological innovations between aerial communities worldwide. "Melbourne just reported successful implementation of our hydroponic farming systems," he announced during the morning briefing, his communications expertise now serving a global network of aerial cities. "And the London settlement has developed improvements to our wind power generation that they're sharing with all connected communities." Marcus's leadership role had evolved from desperate survival coordinator to elected governor of what was now officially recognized as the Free Aerial Territory of Metro City, complete with trade agreements with ground-based survivor settlements and diplomatic recognition from international survivor coalitions. "Today marks 6 months since our last casualty from infected attack," he announced during the celebration assembly, his voice carrying across a community of over 800 residents. "We've proven that cooperation, innovation, and strategic thinking can overcome even the most impossible odds." The teacher Maria had established the first post-apocalypse university, where children who had been born after the outbreak learned not just survival skills but advanced sciences, engineering, and arts that would carry human civilization forward. Tom the electrician had become the director of technological development, overseeing projects that were rapidly advancing beyond pre-outbreak capabilities through necessity-driven innovation. As the sun set over Metro City, painting the aerial bridges and residential towers in golden light. The survivors could see ground-level lights beginning to flicker back to life in the cleared zones below. The infected still controlled vast areas of the city, but they were no longer an expanding threat. They had become a contained problem being systematically solved through human ingenuity and cooperation. The Rooftop War had ended with humanity's decisive victory, not through violence but through adaptation, innovation, and the simple power of people working together toward a common goal. From their position high above the world, the aerial cities had become beacons of hope that proved human civilization could not only survive the apocalypse but emerge stronger, smarter, and more united than ever before.